Hi, everyone. Welcome to our August Histories of the Working Class in North America series. I'm Tahia Islam, and I'm on the education team here at the People's Forum. We are a political education and cultural space in New York City to build an internationalist working class movement. This particular series that we're hosting at the People's Forum is driven by a commitment to better understand the history of working class life and struggle in order to learn lessons that can be applied to the class struggle today. We know that many working class struggles in North America have been obscured in our education growing up, and that forestalls future victories. We've had conversations so far with scholars and activists on Appalachian women's organizing to dock worker labor organizing in San Francisco, and all of those previous recordings can be found on our People's Forum YouTube channel. I'm very excited today to have Naomi Williams for a talk on race, labor, and coalition building in Racine, Wisconsin. There, workers built a labor community that was responsive to and shaped by people's social identities, and that paid off during times of social and political conflict. As an introduction, Professor Naomi R Williams received a PhD from the History Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Their primary research interests include labor and working class history, urban history and politics, gender and women, race and politics, and more broadly, social and economic movements of working people. Naomi's primary focus is on late capitalism at the end of the 20th century and workers' roles in shaping US political economy. Currently, they are revising a book manuscript tentatively titled Workers United, Race, Labor, and Coalition Building in Deindustrialized America, on the transformation of class identity and politics in the second half of the 20th century. The structure of today's talk is that we'll have Naomi speak to us for about an hour, and then we will have an open Q&A. I also have some questions developed from a cohort of organizers that met prior to today's session to read a portion of text from Naomi, and we've developed some questions as well. So I'm really hoping for a dynamic Q&A, so please feel free to go ahead and use that. Those of us on Zoom, you can use a Q&A feature, and on YouTube, you can use the comment section. Naomi, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to speak with us and presenting your history. And now it is over to you.
Thank you, Tahia. I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk to the People's Forum. It's a great honor. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Do you see the PowerPoint?
I think it's getting pulled up. There you go. We see it.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. Good evening. Glad you can join us. My talk today looks at the role of Black union members in shaping a broad-based labor community in Racine, Wisconsin from World War II to the 1980s. These activists not only organized inside their workplaces, but also saw the importance of community-based organizing and support. And Black union activists' involvement in the civil rights movement and other social justice campaigns created a legacy of labor activism and community organizing that extends until today. So race and gender politics shaped the community's working class politics, and as I argue, expanded the ranks of those willing to bring their economic and social justice issues to the public arena. Stories like these are important for us today because they tell a different story than one we've usually heard about labor's decline in the period after the 1960s. Instead, looking at a local community, it shows how the continuing value of social justice unionism. This talk is based on the book project that Tahia mentioned, and it traces the Racine labor community from the 1940s to the 1990s. And I use labor community the way that Racine's worker activists used it in the post-war period to describe the broad coalition that they built and developed around working class politics. And I examined the ways that activists maintained a robust political agenda as demographics change. More and more plants stopped operating, and so people were losing their jobs. And the conservative county residents and elected officials rejected demands for expanding the social safety net programs within the city. Labor activists shifted to embrace issues of race and gender more directly, and they worked to build an engaged, inclusive community that was focused on expanding the liberal agenda. And so I used interviews with local activists that I did, and also that interviews that were done in the 1970s and 1980s. I use union newspapers and local media, city and county records, and other archival materials that I found at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And I show how the hard-fought union battles, the political use of labor history by worker activists, and the willingness of labor unions to join coalitions for social justice, how all these things together kept workers seeking unions and labor activism as the best means to achieve their economic and social goals. So to set the stage, Racine, Wisconsin is a small industrial town on Lake Michigan. It's north of Chicago, just south of Milwaukee. And it had a very diverse manufacturing sector. So there are lots of different manufacturing plants and a long history of union activism by the time we get to the 1970s. So in 1972, just a few years after the height of industrial employment in the late 1960s, Racine's 262 manufacturing companies employed over 10,000 workers. And so together with construction and skilled trade workers, garment industry employees, white collar office workers, city employees, and low-wage service workers, all of these people added to the unionized presence, as there were 50 different union locals with over 17,000 members. And this represented over 26% of the city's workforce. So pretty high union density in the small industrial town of Racine. So Black workers in UAW locals mostly worked diligently in the post-war period to expand Union-won economic gains to more non-white workers. Women, who were really most active in the publishing, garment, and service industries, stressed the necessity of addressing their concerns as well within unions. And the involvement of workers across racial lines in the civil rights and women's movements of the early to mid 1960s created a working class politics that extended the boundaries of the labor movement to include all workers and those seeking to work, including new immigrants to the city, low-wage Black and Latina service workers, welfare right activists, and public school students. So most Black male workers held jobs in foundries where they were making metal castings and auto part or farm machine part plants. They also worked in janitorial services. Black women held mostly domestic service jobs because they were kept out of industrial plants, and they had low-wage service positions in hospitals and throughout the healthcare industry, really. And I started researching the workers' experiences in Racine because it seemed that there was a high level of interracial cooperation and coordination. And I wanted to understand what about the city and the people led to a relatively high union density and an engaged labor community for so many years, including the 1980s and 1990s, when people were saying that labor unions were turning to internal issues and trying to save their jobs, not really concerned with broader social justice issues. And for me, the moment that seemed the best to challenge the established story of race and labor in the period happened in 1976. And that's when white UAW workers joined the picket lines of mostly Black and Latino women who went on strike at a local hospital. The women faced a lot of pressure. There's a lot of bad press in the local media about striking at a hospital and how they weren't looking out for the public good by doing so. But the UAW members in the community joined their picket lines in a show of support. As the women held up signs that read "work, not welfare," the auto workers held up signs that said all workers deserve a decent job. And this is the story that really compelled me to research the community and try to understand what was happening. And the more I came across similar stories and talked with retired workers, I realized that this community offered a different understanding of social and economic justice in the late 20th century. My research shows that during the civil rights era, Black workers in Racine inspired broad-based participation in social justice campaigns. They expanded the concept of who belonged in the labor movement, and they encouraged lots of people to look to working class politics as an answer to a lot of their issues. So looking back on the long history of activism in the United States, oops, I think I went too far on my slide. There we go. So looking back in the long history of Black activism in the US, scholars have started to reconceptualize the origin of the US civil rights movement. Some scholars linking the history of Black political and social networks, as well as organized reform movements from slavery through the Jim Crow era, have illustrated the benefits of describing what we call in the field of history, the long civil rights movement. And making linkages to these histories of activism more explicit in understanding the social movement of the 1960s that you typically think about when you hear civil rights movement. So for example, in a recent book on the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Justice, one historian has illustrated how a study of the networks Black union members created during the buildup to World War II remained a valuable resource in organizing people for the 1963 March. He also points to the long history of Black women organizers within labor and social justice movements who used their access to church groups, labor unions, sororities, and NAACP chapters to spread the word, raise funds, and organize transportation to the event. And throughout the post-war period, Black workers used their local unions and leadership positions within those unions and labor organizations to address social justice issues, to politicize their neighbors, and to promote collaboration among groups working for economic and social justice within the United States. And I think this is really important to point to because so much of the literature and so much of the conversation about, Black workers and unions in the 1950s and 1960s talks about Black workers being excluded from unions or fighting to get into unions. And there's very little focus on what Black workers were doing in unions, and especially those who had leadership positions. So union membership wasn't new. It was expanding, yes, but Black workers had always been very active given the opportunity to participate. And if we only focus on lack of access, we miss the action that's happening inside. And so working class activism in the labor and civil rights movements during the 1960s expanded the boundaries of working class identity. And it focused on social and economic justice for everyone, not just for Black workers, but for everybody. And it created a sense of sustained activity that lasted into the 21st century and continues till today. So in Racine, Black workers like William Blue Jenkins led the way in expanding the idea of who belonged in local labor unions. And I'm gonna spend a lot of time talking about Jenkins tonight because his life story really exemplifies how Black workers got involved in union activities and then moved into community action and local politics. So William Blue Jenkins organized workers at the largest foundry during World War II, led the local branch of the NAACP for several years, and became the first Black president of the county's AFL-CIO Council. And his life experiences gave him the confidence to stand up for himself and others and a keen understanding of the social politics of the city. He moved to Racine in 1917 with his family, coming from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. So following that Great Migration path that a lot of people know about and you learn about in US history classes. His father, Frank Jenkins, worked as a coal miner in Virginia and then moved to Hattiesburg for job opportunities. And a company in Racine that was experiencing a strike actually recruited Black workers from Mississippi to move north to accept jobs. But when Frank Jenkins got to Racine, he discovered that he had been hired as a strikebreaker. He refused to accept the job because he had been a union member. He understood the importance of worker solidarity, and he didn't want to cross the picket line. He eventually found work at a construction company in Racine, and the family decided to stay. They moved into a neighborhood on the north side of town, close to the railroad station. And that meant that they were one of the first Black families in the city, and they provided information to newcomers. So as people moved up to Chicago and then left Chicago on their way to Milwaukee, they would often stop in Racine because it's right there at the train station. And the Jenkins family gave them information about where to find jobs, encouraged them to stay, how to find housing, and other information like that. Jenkins was very outgoing, and he was a local sports star. He knew lots of people in the city, and he had access to many different social networks, and that made him stand out. And it actually gave him a little bit of a head start when it got to later in life, when he got involved in union activities and community activism. He played baseball, softball, and basketball within the Black community, and he was the only Black player on his high school football team. And when his teammates voted him captain, a lot of the parents were outraged. They were like, there's not going to be a Black player who's going to be captain of the football team. But the coach stood up for Jenkins, and that really had a big impact. So he did an interview in 1974, and he said that having the coach stand up for him, because he thought that the coach was going to back down and take away the position. But when his coach stood up for him, he said he realized that he should be able to stand up for other people too. And so when he started his working career in Racine, his first job was at, well, not his first job, but the longest job that he had was at Bell City Malleable, which served as the city's main employer of Black and then later Latino foundry workers. Non-white men often found jobs in foundries because they were the hardest, dirtiest jobs available in manufacturing, and workers who could find better jobs did. And so Black and Latinx workers were overrepresented in foundries in Racine. And although a few Black workers moved up to skilled positions following World War II, they were more often than not passed up for promotion. But they slowly started looking to the various UAW unions to address their concerns about access to jobs and dignity at work. In his interview, Jenkins recalled that he became more involved in his union when he saw the treatment of contract workers from the Caribbean during World War II. Management, he said, misused those guys. What did they know about union contracts? They were really discriminated against. It was bad. And after the war, fear about layoffs led some workers to demand that the contract workers be fired and forced out of the company. Now, while Black workers were also wanted to protect their jobs and they were worried about seniority, they resented what they saw as racism on the part of white unionists. So for example, at a union meeting, a white member suggested that they send the SOBs back in cattle cars if we have to. Jenkins remembered, I got up and I really blew my top. I was cussing. I got pretty excited at that meeting. And after that, the guys started coming to me then. And workers continued to look to Jenkins for advice and guidance, but it was a long time before he was elected to an official position of leadership within the union. But he said he was determined to keep running for office in the union until he could be of some use to his people. Jenkins would finally be elected union president in 1955 after holding various other positions. And then he was elected again to union president in 1957 and served until 1960. He was elected president of the Racine County AFL-CIO in 1962. And he served as a chairman of the Foundry Subcouncil for District 2, which represented 4 different states within the Midwest. He served 2 terms as president of the Racine chapter of the NAACP. He advised the Mayor's Council on Human Rights. He worked in the county's Democratic Party apparatus. And in the 1970s and 1980s, he successfully ran for a seat on the school board. He worked with unemployed young people in the community, and he sat on various neighborhood improvement boards. So Jenkins is really distinct and unique. He had a long career of community activism and labor activism within Racine, and he was very well known in the city. His story is important to the history of Black activism in the 1970s and 80s because so many people like him navigated an interconnected world, and they understood themselves as fighting for economic and social justice on multiple fronts. So they knew they had to do work at work, they had to do work in the community, they had to do work in local politics. So Jenkins, Leroy Worley, Corrine Owens, Julian Thomas, Al Herod, and so many other Black activists in Racine stood up for equal employment, better housing, access to public education, and welfare rights in the city. They joined unions, ran for political office, led social justice organizations, and built coalitions. And their efforts created a legacy of Black worker activism. They made racial justice a key element of the community's labor politics and legitimized Black participation in public life, which was really important where Black people only made up 8% of the population in the city in the 1960s and 70s. And their work to democratize their workplace unions spread into community activism and political engagement. And you have scholars and activists like Tara Hunter, Bayard Rustin, and Robin Kelly, and they've all pointed to a long history of Black people in the United States using local institutions to carve political, economic, and social freedoms, despite the limitations of those institutions, which again is another important lesson for us today. You know, we might get really frustrated with organizations and institutions that we belong to and feel like they're not moving fast enough, but there are creative ways to make things happen within these institutions and to reshape them in forms that are actually more helpful for us. So in the late 1960s, Black workers were joining unions more than any other group. And this was partly due to expanded access to public sector jobs after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Not only did Black workers join unions, they used their union membership to continue the call for equal employment, to influence local elections, so that they could have a say in issues around housing and education in their communities, and to provide economic security for themselves and their families. And this activism, based in the labor movement and community focus, confirms historians' assessment that despite their weaknesses, labor organizations have proved like a major stimulus for social reform and a vehicle for the working poor to gain an active voice in American public life. So really what this means is that working people do have the ability to reshape the US political economy. And if we join forces together, then we can make those changes. And I just want to point out that while I'm focusing tonight on the activism of Black workers in Racine were not doing this alone. They were not working in isolation. Workers across racial lines, across immigration status, genders, religion, ethnicities, they were all working together. And there was a cohort of labor activists who really shaped the labor politics of the city from World War II through the 1980s. And they passed this on to the next generation of labor activists, union organizers, et cetera. And so these and other activists shaped a class politics that sought to encompass the whole community through union organizing and civic engagement, what people call whole worker unionism. They use worker education and political mobilization. And what's really stood out to me was their political use of labor history in the city. Every time there was a big fight, workers would say, well, remember what happened 10 years ago, remember what happened 15 years ago. And union members knew the history of their unions. They could tell you about the fights that they won and why it mattered and why it was so important. And while all of the union members didn't walk right in lockstep with these core activists, what the activists did was create an environment that encouraged people to look to working class politics as an answer to their questions. Workers showed up for each other on picket lines. They organized across employment sectors. They ran for political office so that they could support working class issues. And they did all of this stuff because they saw it as their civic duty and their responsibility to be involved in the community. In my research examining the civil rights, labor, and social justice activism in Racine extends that idea that I mentioned earlier of the long civil rights movement forward. It shows how union activity in the city reshaped the demographics of the local labor movement. It didn't just consist of white male industrial workers, but they're Black workers, low-wage service workers, public employees, and they were all, not all, but most of them were working together to gain access to economic security and that idea of social citizenship that's expressed in the notion of an American dream, something that we don't even think or talk about very much anymore. And today I want to share 4 examples that show how Black workers' activism inspired broad community involvement in Racine. Worker activists joined local residents to advocate for welfare rights, public school families, low-paid hospital workers, and immigrant workers in a determined effort to extend post-war promises of economic security. So the first example I want to talk about is a coalition that developed in 1969 between welfare rights activists, housing activists, and county social workers to improve neighborhoods and improve county services for those needing access to social safety net protections. But first, the backstory. In Racine, during the Great Migration, and especially in the buildup to World War II, tons of new residents were coming into the city, and their housing stock just was not available. There weren't places to live, and they actually set up temporary housing along the edges of the city, and those temporary structures were still in place by the 1960s. So you can imagine the deteriorated conditions that it was in. And access to affordable quality housing had been a longstanding issue since the 1940s for non-white residents in particular. And by the mid-1960s, activists and their allies had created a space where Black and brown workers and their families could actively participate in local debates around these issues. And the work of Black union activists especially kind of set the tone for community-wide understanding that all workers and those seeking to work belonged in the labor movement, belonged as a member of that labor community. And it wasn't a perfect situation, but it was a space for them to make noise. And that's what they did. William Jenkins vocally protested the slow-moving access to skilled manufacturing and public sector jobs for non-white workers. And in his interview, he said that while Racine had always been known as a progressive town regarding labor issues, that race was still a dividing factor. And even him, a very well-known person in the community, had a hard time buying a house. His wife, who was very light-skinned, would go with her mother, and the real estate agent would be really happy. And then Jenkins would show up, who's dark-skinned, and suddenly the house was no longer available. It was sold. One of his white friends offered to buy a house in his name, but Jenkins felt like that was, an attack on his manhood, because he should be able to buy a house in whatever neighborhood he wanted, by himself without any help or assistance. It was a constant battle for Black and brown people in Racine in the 1960s. But Jenkins and other activists continually pushed city and county officials to provide neighborhood improvements into rental housing and to provide legislation prohibiting discrimination in the housing market. But the activism of Jenkins and others created an opportunity for various communities to bring these ideas to the public. And all of this momentum caused the mayor in 1966 in his State of the City address to make improving neglected neighborhoods a priority. And he blamed the city's decreasing tax base and increasing social problems on the flight to suburbia and the failure to implement sanitation codes and fair housing laws. But the new legislation met resistance from the Real Estate Association and from building trades unions and landlords. The landlords were unwilling to make the improvements on the existing housing stock. But in response to Black and a growing number of Latinx residents' demands for anti-discrimination housing laws, the mayor formed a committee to find a solution to Racine's housing problems. So a year later, the committee's plan called for a 9-month education campaign for fair housing. And their whole campaign was based on convincing white residents that other racial groups would make good neighbors. So you can imagine how frustrated Black and brown residents were with this, 9-month study that just came back with, very ridiculous education campaign. And the mayor did implement some small things, but in that whole time period, the city council never passed a fair housing law. They did a little bit of improvement, but it didn't affect the overcrowding, deteriorated buildings, and lack of city services in particular neighborhoods. And this failure to pass a fair housing code actually prevented Racine from applying for federal urban renewal aid. But the Real Estate Association and the Building Trades Council advocated against it, and their side won the debate. Private enterprise, however, did very little to alleviate the continual housing shortage in the city. And tensions continued to build around poor access to housing and race relations throughout the late 1960s. In August of 1967, there were lots of rumors and threats of violence going across the city, and it led the mayor to form another committee, and they decided to open community centers in the neighborhoods so that they could stay open longer to keep young people off the streets. They did provide some job service agents in those community centers. They held public meetings to kind of listen to residents' concerns. And these community centers had been open for a few years, and they provided space for the community to get together and have social set meetings, but it just wasn't enough to really deal with the concrete issues that residents were facing. And lots of Mexican Americans who had been migrating to Racine's, throughout the 20th century really increased their migration in the 1960s and 1970s. Then you started to get Puerto Ricans coming into Racine. And In the mid 1960s into the late 1960s, these neighborhoods represented 2/3 of the residents. So Black and Mexican American residents represented 2/3 of the residents in these inner city neighborhoods who were demanding that the mayor make changes. And so in June 1968, so started in this 1966 mayoral State of the City address. So in June of 1968, the city's efforts culminated in what they called Race Unity Week. They had a picnic and panel discussions on race relations, education, and religion. But they didn't do anything, again, to address the neighborhood deterioration within the Black and brown communities. And the residents felt betrayed by lack of actual improvements to their living conditions. And then in August, just a couple of months later, the police response to a fight at a party led to what I'm going to call a protest. It wasn't a widespread city protest, but people broke windows in neighborhood businesses, some looted stores, and about 30 people were arrested for mostly disorderly conduct. Some people were injured and one person was shot. And local residents felt that the protest had its roots in the failure of the larger community to take action on the grievances of the neighborhoods. And a group of local residents got together with union members and they formed a committee, met with the mayor, and they demanded that he move on the housing code legislation, better policing, and social services. They also said that they wanted the mayor to hire a more diverse police force and other people within the firefighting and welfare offices. And Julian Thomas, who then was president of the NAACP and was also a UAW union member, went on the radio broadcast UAW Speaks. And he talked about it. He talked about the protests. And he explained that the young people of color in the city had become disillusioned because, and I quote, "They see us beat at the doors of City Hall, the welfare office, and other agencies and come away empty-handed." And it really got to that sense of despair that people felt that there were no opportunities available to them. They felt stuck. At the same time, sociologists from the University of Iowa were conducting a study in Racine, and they did it throughout the 1960s. And over the decade, they demonstrated that the increased concentration of Mexican American and Black residents within Racine's inner city left them in what the sociologists called isolated ghettos. Surveys revealed that the residents felt isolated and hoped for better integration within the economy and society. 63% of Black residents felt that housing discrimination limited their ability to secure better jobs and education for their children. And these conditions fueled the anger and frustration that was demonstrated by the protests. And Racine was not unique, right? This was happening across the nation. Government policies at the national and state levels shifted funding to suburbs and away from urban centers. Rebellions occurred in the late 1960s in places like Milwaukee, Chicago, Tampa, Cincinnati, Baltimore, Detroit, and that's just to name a few. And the Kerner Commission, which was charged with studying areas hit by these protests, pointed to unemployment, underemployment, police practices, and housing issues that led to what we now call the urban crisis. And the report called for national action to combat discrimination, create jobs, renew urban areas, and build more public housing outside of ghettos. But these recommendations were never implemented on a national scale. And instead of responding to local Black community leaders, Racine officials organized yet another study. And this time they said, okay, well, let's focus on welfare organizations in the area. And this is getting to the coalition that developed between the social workers and the welfare rights activists. So they shifted their focus away from housing to try to address other issues. And part of it was access to jobs, but most of it really focused on public aid recipients. And so what the study did was said, okay, well, let's get some community members to sit on a board to help make decisions about the social welfare offices. There was a city office and a county office for welfare needs, and they decided to try to combine it into one big office. But labor, civil rights, and resident activists kept pressure on city officials to make concrete changes to neighborhoods. And the momentum from this 2-year battle helped fuel a social worker strike in county offices during the winter of 1968 and 1969. And they were represented by the International Association of Machinists, Lodge number 437. The social workers were just as dissatisfied as the welfare recipients. They had low pay rates. They didn't feel like they had enough training, and they didn't understand promotion procedures, and they didn't have any individual authority to deal with cases. So there are lots of institutional barriers to helping recipients, welfare recipients. Turnover in the department was really high. It was a very hard job. And it limited caseworkers' ability to help applicants because turnover meant that applicants had to start all over. So it's a very frustrating situation all around. And when negotiations failed to produce any changes in policy from the County Board of Supervisors who oversaw the welfare services, social workers started an informational picketing campaign, which turned into a strike. Social workers received the support of local residents because the strikers' demands mirrored some of the suggestions that welfare services recipients had said that they wanted to see. And it also listed some of the things that came out in the study as things that they wanted implemented within the county office, but the County Board of Supervisors had never moved on. So the Countywide Labor Association, the AFL-CIO, and lots of other unions who sat outside of the AFL-CIO supported the social workers' demands and the welfare rights recipients, the welfare activists, let me call them welfare activists, right? They said that, of course, they needed to improve training, they needed secure jobs so that they could do their jobs. And after 6 weeks of negotiations, the strike, picketing by welfare activists, the county board finally agreed to implement some of the things that came out in the study and the social workers' demand. They increased the number of caseworkers, they included pay raises, and they created a merit system within the social worker or within the welfare office. And this was an important strike. It was very important for the Racine labor community because while city and county workers had gone on strike several times before, and even during the post-war period, this strike by social workers who were seen as like professional workers opened conversations about the rights of teachers and hospital workers to use strikes as a tool for gaining economic and workplace demands. It also highlighted the link between the working poor and labor unions as an avenue for gaining economic security and social capital. And the public debate around the strike highlighted the labor community's continued commitment to broad-based notion of this post-war liberal idea. So building trades workers, Teamsters, UAW workers, postal workers, teachers, everybody came out with news articles and opinions saying that they supported the social workers, that they had the right to go on strike. And it was very important to see them just as legitimate workers as the UAW workers were, which was the biggest union in the city at the time. But despite the changes and despite the coalition between the social workers union and the welfare rights recipients, there were still lots of issues within the organization. And so in August of 1969, the welfare recipients held a sit-in at the county services office and presented a letter with demands saying, okay, you need to fix these issues. You have to make sure that caseworkers are trained properly to treat people with respect, more access to service, extended hours, and a training program. This is a big community support for the sit-in. The Milwaukee priest and civil rights activist, who is also an NAACP youth branch leader, Father James Groppe, came to Racine and he led a young people's march. And they really included the social worker strike, the welfare rights activists, and housing demands all in this big event within the month of August. And Groppe was known nationwide as a supporter of better housing and social services for oppressed groups in Wisconsin. And activists formed a coalition with local residents, the NAACP, particular social workers, especially union leaders within the machinist union, and other members of the Racine labor community. And they went on the offensive and said, okay, we need to fix housing issues. We need to solve the discontent amongst young people. We need to make sure that welfare recipients are treated as members of the labor movement. And this is really key, right? Because and I'll get to this later, a lot of low-wage service workers, they had full-time jobs, but they still qualify for welfare benefits. And when industrial plants would close, a lot of people were living paycheck to paycheck. And so they were dependent on aid during these downtimes. And the union members really wanted to kind of change the narrative around who's worthy, right? Because you talk about the worthy poor, the unworthy poor, and the negative stigmas that are associated with receiving aid, public aid. And this community worker coalition developed really as a direct result of Black activists constantly stressing the relationship among lack of access to jobs, welfare reform, and neighborhood improvement. So in my second example of workers joining community activists, I want to look at school janitors and food service workers who came together with parents during the strike. The Racine Unified School District started a desegregation program that entailed massive busing and the closing of area schools, mostly with large Black enrollments in the late 1960s. This created all sorts of problems. One of which was there are a lot of students who had been attending neighborhood schools who had the free lunch program. And then they were bused across town to predominantly white schools in more affluent neighborhoods that did not have the free lunch program. So the NAACP led a call to provide hot lunches at all the new schools. And although the school board did respond within a few months to the request for hot lunches, the Racine NAACP actually asked the federal government to get involved and to oversee the integration of schools in Racine. I just want to point out, because people often look at school desegregation as a Southern issue, but it was well into the 1970s before Racine in Wisconsin had fully implemented a school integration program. So schools were mostly pretty segregated in the late 1960s. And then the closing of one of the few remaining elementary schools, Howell Elementary, intensified the school closing debate. The school board's failure to budget building renovations led the fire department to close Howell Elementary right before Christmas break in 1971. So middle of the school year, fire department comes in to do a routine inspection and realizes that the school is unsafe. So they close the school. When the students come back from Christmas break, they are attending a different school. The young students had to walk over a mile to attend a new school because the school board refused to provide bus service. And what they said was, okay, under 1 mile, you don't need or under 2 miles, you don't need a bus. You can make it there on your own. Well, of course, this was a complete disruption to parents and students' lives at this time. Parents immediately tried to do a carpool service to get the students to school. And really they were concerned with the kindergartners and first graders. They felt like it was too far for them to walk. And then parents founded Back Our Youth organization, trying to build a fundraising campaign in order to pay for a bus. So the school board said, you know, if you provide the money, then we'll provide a bus. The parents struggled to get the money that they needed. So the janitors union, SEIU Local 152, and other workers in the community stepped in, and they provided the funds to cover a bus for the students. And I was very excited to see this letter in the archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society. It was a letter from the county AFL-CIO actually to the NAACP, donating money for the school bus so these kids from Howell Elementary could have a ride to school, a safe ride to school. And it's an important reminder that union members are not just concerned with their particular workplaces, but can also be actively engaged in supporting communities in which they work. So in January 1972, when the school janitors went on strike, and this is just really a month after the Howell Elementary closed, they gained public support because they condemned the closure of Howell Elementary. And they pointed out that the school board had voted for raises for themselves, and they had spent all kinds of money on new schools in the suburbs, but they neglected the needs of children within the inner city. And the service worker publicly condemned them. And after the week-long strike and with support of local parents, SEIU Local 152 negotiated the requested pay raise and the cost of living raises that they were bargaining for. They upgraded the pay level of some of the food service workers who were mostly women and mostly women of color. And they kept the board from splitting up their bargaining unit. So they had male maintenance workers who were actually very skilled workers getting very high rates of pay. And so they wanted to split those guys off from the rest of the union, and the union was able to fight that off. And this activism inspired other groups. So the strike was such a momentum driving force within the community that college and high school students got together and they said they wanted to be involved. So they joined the revolutionary youth movement and provided free breakfast for local students in inner city neighborhoods. So the Revolutionary Youth Movement program was inspired by the breakfast program that the Black Panther Party did in cities like Chicago, Oakland, and other places. And the young activists provided meals, and at breakfast, students learned about Black and Chicano activists and labor and other social justice leaders in the community. And the goal of these high school and college students, right, was to improve race relations amongst the Black and brown students and the white students who were also living in that area. And they tried to explain that economic and political elites provoked racial divisions amongst the poor to keep poor people poor. And that doing this would prevent them from joining forces to improve their living and working conditions. And the Latinx population had really started growing dramatically in the 1970s in that whole corridor between Chicago and Green Bay. And with this growing strength of the Chicano movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s, students in southeastern Wisconsin started organizing, and they demanded more high school and college courses on Chicano and Latinx history and heritage. And despite the limited success at the University of Wisconsin locations in Madison and Milwaukee, students and staff at the smaller Whitewater campus in Southeast Wisconsin successfully created a Chicano Studies program, the first Chicano Studies program in the state of Wisconsin. And the labor community in Racine, in which the labor movement more broadly, right, at the national level was seen as hostile or at least distant from new left activists in the 1970s. But in Racine, the labor community welcomed these young students into their community. UAW unions and the larger AFL-CIO council in the county often sponsored talks by scholar activists at the UW Parkside campus, which is just south of Racine in the twin city of Kenosha. And when the school board continued to spend disproportionately on inner city schools, a local sociology professor from UW Parkside, who had been active in these study groups, and William Jenkins, won seats on the school board. And for several years, they worked to improve local schools in the community and make sure that the funding was more fairly distributed. And these group efforts really demonstrated the strong link between social justice and labor in Racine. And the community efforts to improve education opportunities despite poor local funding. And funding really was a problem in Racine. Lots of families had moved out of the city, and so the tax base took a big hit. Businesses had started closing in the mid-1960s. So 1966 was really the first time a big plant closed down in the city. But the activism around everything that happened in 1972, and it actually continued throughout the decade, led to lots of elementary and junior high schools and local community centers in Racine are named after the activists who were actively involved during this period. The integration of schools, providing transportation to school students, and improving the school board. And this was a long fight that is more detailed in the larger article that some people have read. And I can answer questions in more detail about this during the Q&A. But this is the environment, right? This is the environment that led to the hospital workers going on strike in 1976 at St. Luke's Hospital. And this is my third example. This is the mostly Black and Latino women were members, 252 members of SEIU Local 150. And they went on strike in 1976 because they wanted higher wages, right? They wanted to work without needing to depend on welfare to survive and to feed their families. They were featured in local news stories, and other workers joined their picket lines. Like I talked about the UAW workers who showed up with their signs saying all workers deserve fair wages. And the local AFL-CIO community gave them space to meet the hospital workers at the Racine Labor Center. So they got a lot of support from the community. Auto workers, postal workers, teachers, and other labor activists provided financial support and gave them advice when bargaining with the hospital management. The service workers were members of a 7,000 member local of SEIU, Local 150. It was a statewide local. And the president, who was based in Milwaukee, went behind their back and accepted a backroom deal from the management without the permission of the workers. And the new contract only offered 1 penny more per hour for the nurses' aides. And it didn't deal with any of their workplace dignity demands for respect at work. And it didn't end in victory. This 1976 strike did not end in victory for the service workers at St. Luke's. However, the help that they received from other union members inspired them to become more involved in their union, and actually changed the union leadership over several years. They helped them to organize around other issues in the community and to continue to push for their workplace demands. Ron Thomas, who was a former UAW member, got a job as an organizer with SEIU, and I was able to interview him in 2013. And he explained to me that him and some of the other people felt like they had to Racine-ize SEIU Local 150. And to me, that really kind of goes back to what I was saying about the labor community and how active they were and how powerful they felt, right? Because union leaders in Racine really prided themselves on operating very democratic and open unions. And they wanted their members to always understand what was happening and why. And they gave everyone a chance to voice their opinions. And so when he took a job as a business representative for SEIU, he really worked with Local 150 to change the tone, if you will, of the union and turn it into a social justice organization instead of like a business union. And by the mid-1980s, the hospital workers at St. Luke's had achieved many of their earlier workplace goals, including decent pay raises and more direct control of their work environment at the hospital. And beyond the workplace, the union members got involved in the community-wide labor board. They attended monthly roundtable meetings on workplace justice issues. They joined a political group about raising utility costs, to how to address raising utility costs. They didn't want to raise utility costs. And they raised money to donate to Ethiopia during a famine. And their experiences in the labor movement led to greater participation in local politics and showed them how direct action could bring change. And when many of the women who were working as nurses' aides lost their jobs in the 1990s, they fell back into the welfare system. They became leaders in the local welfare rights organizations. And in interviews they made with sociologists, in interviews they gave with the local sociologists, they made direct links to their union activities and their continuing struggles for economic security and personal dignity. So it's a really clear link when you look at the comments that they made between their union activities in the 1970s and their welfare rights activism in the 1990s. So in the final example, I want to talk about the way UAW Local 553 joined forces with immigrant worker groups in the mid-1980s. And by the 1980s, the city of Racine faced an unprecedented economic crisis. Over the previous 2 decades, as Black workers fought for access to high-paying manufacturing jobs, plants began leaving the city. And the local economy moved toward low-wage service sector jobs, while industrial and public service jobs really declined. And many industrial workers faced long periods of unemployment with few options to gain new skills. And UAW 553 at Racine Steel Castings, which was formerly Bell City Malleable, where William Jenkins worked during World War II, had the highest number of Black and brown workers in the city, as I explained before, because it was a foundry. And it was very hard, dirty, hot work. And the community services division of the union was active in demanding quality services from community agencies. Layoffs and other economic setbacks took a toll on the city. And social problems that we know happened in Rust Belt cities became increasingly common. Very high unemployment, especially for non-white workers, increased crime and drug and alcohol addiction. And Local 553 members pushed the A Center, which was an agency to help alcoholics in the community, to hire Black and Latinx counselors after several of their members complained about the treatment they received. So if workers showed up and they were drunk at work or something like that, instead of being fired, they were sent to community service organizations to get help. And a lot of Black workers complained that the white social workers just really didn't understand their concerns and issues. They didn't know how to talk to them, and they were really frustrated. And so administrators at the center claimed that there were no Black applicants for social worker positions and that race wasn't a factor in providing services, that they were there for everybody. But continual pressure by the union and by community allies really forced the center to change. And they finally hired 3 new counselors, 2 Black men and 1 Latino man, to take positions of social workers within the A Center. And addressing these issues of race relations and equal access and discrimination went a long way in strengthening workers' commitment to using their union and working class politics more broadly to address these types of issues in the city. And this is a union that really worked most closely with the immigrant rights group. Immigration and immigration reform were very hotly debated in the 1980s, and it was fueled in part by economic instability and the rise of cultural conservatism and the nationalist rhetoric that Ronald Reagan was using in his Cold War policies and in his 1984 re-election campaign. And although many undocumented workers filled a real economic need as more and more jobs became de-skilled and paid lower wages, political and popular rhetoric against immigration and integration within workplaces in the 1980s declared that there was an increasing problem of undocumented workers, which really was not true. And in June 1984, the US Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, which is now ICE, started a series of raids at Racine steel castings. And often at the behest of companies, the INS would go into workplaces, round up workers, and then detain them until they could provide documentation of their right to work in the United States. And over the next several months, INS agents detained 19 workers and charged them with being in the country without proper documentation. And I will note that this was exactly during contract bargaining sessions, right? So the workers were in the middle of bargaining for a workplace contract with the employer, and then the employer called in immigration. And as it happened in other Midwestern communities, like St. Paul and Chicago and Racine, union and Latinx community activists worked together to provide legal aid for those detained. And the president of the union, Dick Fott, worked with local organizations to help families find the documents that they needed. And he argued for workers' immediate release from detention centers and right to due process. The union demanded that the detained workers, many of whom had over 5 years of service with the company, keep their jobs, remain on the payroll until their cases were heard. And it worked, right? So 17 of the 19 people got their jobs back, and these efforts created a lasting bond between unions and immigration rights groups. And even today, an immigrant rights organization, Voices de la Frontera, keeps its offices in the Racine Labor Center. So these examples demonstrate the ways that Black union members helped sustain social justice activism in Racine after the high tide of civil rights activism of the 1960s. Through their actions and commitment to a broad-based social justice ethos, workers reshaped the local labor community and demanded a voice in public debate. And these and similar stories like this emphasize the importance of looking for determination instead of seeing decline or decay in urban settings, as we try to explain the ways that Black activists forged space to gain racial and economic justice. Black workers continue to use unions as an avenue for economic and social justice. And Black workers are still the most likely to join unions when given the opportunity. And young workers are the ones leading the campaigns to increase the minimum wage, end on-call scheduling, and expand economic and social justice. And I argue that this phenomenon can be explained by examining the history of Black activism after the heyday of the 1960s. Black workers have continued to use unions and the larger labor movement to provide a reliable avenue to get space to bring their demands to the public. And this history also undermines the oppositional narrative that scholars and activists attach to post-1960s movements for racial and social justice. Some writers have suggested that the focus on individual rights put the civil rights movement at odds with the labor movement, and a liberal policymaker had to choose, right, between constituencies. But a closer look at the history complicates such narratives. As engaged labor activists continue to respond to and adapt class politics, new avenues of organizing and politicizing workers emerged. Racial politics in Racine did not undermine notions of class solidarity. And as was the case in other places, post-war racial politics actually reshaped class politics in urban settings, and activists in these communities adapted to new circumstances. And new demographics will also change the avenues toward producing class solidarity. More and more immigrant workers, women, contingent workers are joining the workforce due to migration, continued shifts in employment, and slow-moving economies. And as seen in Racine, new workers bring new ideas and new influences to the labor movement. The workers and their organizations can't do it alone, right? We need an active government that's involved and an engaged citizenry that recognizes the value of collective action. And the continued importance of working class identity and politics in Racine, even in this current state of post-industrial decline, offers hope, in my opinion, to those looking to make the world a better place. It recenters Black low-wage worker activists in the history of economic justice of the United States. In today's fight for 15 campaigns and Black Lives Matter protests and domestic workers call for a Bill of Rights, Black workers, students, and allies are using established institutions in exciting ways and creating fresh alliances to generate debate, call attention to injustice, and demand change. And women of color are at the forefront of these struggles, and they work within and beyond traditional labor unions and social justice organizations. And so often the larger battles are fueled by struggles in the workplace. And these campaigns are also in the communities. The 2020 murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, coming as they did back to back when the pandemic's economic crisis took hold, ushered in a wave of local and national protests. Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and their allies took to the streets, right, to demand a racial reckoning, a confrontation with racial capitalism, Black liberation, and economic justice. And BIPOC and low-wage workers showcase their central role in the US economy while trying to survive on poverty wages. And local communities demanded yet again to defund the police for equality before the law. And these mobilizations and the people leading them represent the future of work and workers. They also represent a long history of Black-led, interracial, community-based mobilizations for economic justice and Black liberation. In the spring and summer 2020 mobilizations and protests are presented really, right, as racial justice issues. But most analyses of the response to the pandemic and the economic crisis fail to understand that these mobilizations are worker-led, and they're fueled not only by the current crisis, but by years of community-based organizing around economic justice and Black liberations. And these organizational efforts, These mobilizations and the organizing efforts of workers around the 2020 US presidential election, and this slide is really looking at the work of Unite Here, illustrate the ways working people are fighting with renewed vigor against runaway inequality, austerity measures, and the attacks on economic democracy that have shaped the growth of neoliberal global capitalism over the last 40 years. And it shows that workers continue to have the ability to leverage their collective power to influence the political economy of their communities and the nation. And today, when the future of democracy is in question, it is more important than ever that workers mobilize as a united class to ensure more people have access to living wages and safe working conditions and dignity and respect at work. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Wow, thank you so much, Naomi, for this history and for laying it out for us. Extremely inspiring and powerful, the organizing that went down in Racine, Wisconsin.
Thank you, Tahia.
Thank you for sharing this with us. We are now opening it up to Q&A, so you can put your questions in the YouTube chat. You can also put it in the Q&A here on Zoom. And as you are forming your questions and putting them in, I'm going to start with one question, bringing it back to the beginning of your presentation. You laid out a little bit Wisconsin's geography and just the data of what it looked like at the time. Why did you decide to write about Racine, Wisconsin and all its bits of labor history? And I'll start with that and I have a follow-up to it.
Okay, great. Yeah, so, I went to Wisconsin because I wanted to study labor history. And, when I was in undergrad, I was really disappointed, if you will, kind of reading this history, because what I was reading in my textbooks didn't really represent my experiences growing up in Louisiana and interracial labor communities that I was a part of and the work that I was doing. It didn't look like what I was studying in school. And I finally took a class on oral history methodology, and it was about labor in the South. So it was really great because I was like, oh, wait, here are my people. This is what I want to hear. Why isn't this more, taught more fully? And so I decided to get a PhD because I wanted to, make the world a better place for working people. That's what I wanted to do. And I was very fortunate to be accepted into the program at Wisconsin. And for me, it was like the home of labor history and the field of labor history as an academic field. So I was like, oh yes, it's really great to be here. And it just happened I was at a campus event and I met the sociologist who was doing the welfare rights. She was writing a book on welfare rights in Milwaukee. And she asked me, hey, why are you here? Why are you in grad school? And I told her that I wanted to talk about interracial worker organizations. And she's like, I have this great story of nurses' aides at this hospital in Racine. And, they went on strike. It was an awful strike. Things went really wrong, but the UAW workers were really supportive, and maybe you should find this. So she let me read a chapter of her book before it was published, and it was super exciting, right? It was great to see all these pictures in the newspaper of these Black and brown women on their picket lines, and all these white guys surrounding them. So the UAW workers actually created a barrier around the women strikers because one of the women had been hit by a police car on the picket line. And so after that happened, the UAW workers were like, no, we're not going to let this. We're not going to let this be. And so I wanted to understand why, right? In the 1970s, when plants were closing and UAW workers were losing their jobs in Racine, what made it happen? And it was close enough, right, so that I could drive, the hour and a half to go and talk to people and still be able to do my coursework in Madison. And it, just kind of fell into my lap. And these people really became my heroes. So being able to talk to them and build relationships with them meant a lot to me. And that's why I want to make sure I tell their story.
Yep, that's amazing. Thank you, Naomi, for sharing that. And, we don't particularly think of Wisconsin as a place of successful labor movements, but obviously we've been proven wrong. What about that location lends itself to this radical labor organizing?
So it actually has a very long history. And, Wisconsin, there were a lot of not a lot. So there's a famous socialist mayor in Milwaukee and lots of organizing around, and I'm not going to go all the way back in time, but I'll start with the Great Depression, right? So there's lots of organizing during the 1930s and just really hard fought battles. And again, they were really strategic in holding on to these stories about what they did to organize their unions and form unions at different places. And it also had a lot of different small plants. So Racine's a pretty small town, right? But they were supplying auto parts to plants in Chicago and Milwaukee and other places. So if you think about the fact that, in 1970s, there are 50 unions, that's a lot of different unions. And it wasn't like a one one industry town. So they were making farm equipment with Case, J.I. Case Company. There was a large publishing sector, lots of garment workers. They made small household appliances, blenders, and things like that in Racine. So there are a lot of different places to have jobs, and that diversity really helped them. So if for example, the auto workers were out of work, then they could get jobs at the foundry making parts that they were shipping to other places. And so, for example, in Kenosha, their biggest plant and really the main industrial plant was an auto company. And so when that plant closed, everybody was out of work. But in Racine, because there was so much diversity across different sectors, that really helped. And then, like I said, that group of labor activists who were really engaged and involved kept building momentum, if you will, for what was happening. They had a labor newspaper. So they had a weekly newspaper for 40 years. They ran for 40 years. And, they presented information like every summer. There was a big issue on what the labor movement has given you. So take your vacation, go to these different sites and know that it's brought to you by a union, right? Everybody knows the book, brought to you by, weekends brought to you by the union, right? So it was that kind of public space that they created. They had several mayors in this period between the 1940s and the 1990s that came out of labor unions. They won lots of seats on the city council and the school board. So they're very active. They wrested control of the charitable organizations from the business elite. And so they had union representation on like the United Way campaigns and things like that. So they really kept working class issues in the public. And I think that was part of the reason that the labor community remained so robust and adaptive. And that's another key point. They were open to critique. And so they had lots of debates and lots of internal fighting, but they did it in such a way that they expanded who got to be considered a part of the movement. And they actually changed their policies and directions based on the critiques that they were getting from union members. Again, they really prided themselves on being more progressive than Milwaukee, more progressive than Chicago. And they really wanted to show, hey, look at us, we're small, but we have a lot of power. And there's a quote from a guy in the 1960s, I think, and he says, when you have control of a thing, then you can do great things. So for example, when Jenkins was president of the AFL-CIO, he instituted a dental plan, and he got local pharmacies, like before there's big healthcare packages, he got local pharmacies to give discounts to union members. And so they did all of these types of things to really get people to look to their unions for answers. They donated money to local hospitals and orphanages, and they were just really very public with what the activities that they were doing. And all of this created this energy. And then also generations, right? So a lot of the people I interviewed said, yeah, so my uncle or my mother was a union member. And so when I got a job, then I wanted to be really active in my union because I knew how important it was. So it just created a lot of different legacies.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was one of the questions that had come up for us as we read your text. Like, what made the foundation of the union so strong in the community? And clearly, it's a mix of political education, it's media and newspapers, it's being public facing, it's joining local boards and political seats. It's welcoming in new people with open arms at all times. It's generational legacies. So that's beautiful to see. We're curious a little bit about I guess you mentioned a socialist mayor. So can you expand a bit more on the socialist influences on some of this labor organizing? What existed? What were the pushbacks? That kind of thing.
Yeah. So Milwaukee had a socialist mayor for a long time, and that created a lot of tension actually within Racine. So it wasn't all perfect and wonderful. And this is one of the points that comes out in the book that's not really in the article that y'all read. There was a huge anti-communist component within Racine. And they wanted to distance themselves from the socialist mayor. And they actually ran communists out of the city in the 1940s and 1950s. At first, the public workers, right, were organized by communist-led unions, or a lot of communists were involved in the unions. And then after the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, in Racine, they really like pushed those people out. So, you know, it's a complicated history, and not everybody was accepted with open arms. You really had to conform, especially in that earlier period, you really had to conform to the anti-communist wing of the labor movement during that period. But it was later, really during the Vietnam War, when a lot of the younger workers were protesting the war. And they were very active in the union. And there was this huge debate at the time, and it played out in the newspaper, because you had a lot of the union leaders saying, you know, okay, we're going to support this, and a lot of the younger workers really pushing back and saying, no, we're not, we don't have to, you know, and they kind of broke ranks. And that's something too that I think made Racine stand out, because even there were a lot of UAW leadership within Racine that wanted to kind of stick to the UAW national party line, if you will. And they got a lot of resistance from their union members. But because the unions were so open and democratic in Racine, they would go against, you know, UAW national policy over and over again. So going through the archives and kind of reading their reports, you would see all of these letters saying, hey, you need to get your union members in line. You need to follow the policy. You know, they shouldn't be going on strike right now. And, you know, the union leaders writing back and say, no, our members are demanding that we do this. And so that tension too, right? Dealing with that tension really made them very adaptive to change. And I don't know if I answered every part of that question. So if you need to ask something else again, go ahead and ask it again.
Yeah, that definitely helps and explains some of our questions.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess I'm curious about, you talk about how they were able to break tensions. They saw their unions representing them, union members really fighting for what they wanted. You mentioned in your lecture how union members could tell you the histories of their unions, and they were very like deeply invested in that. What is your take on how a lot of workers are represented by their unions today? We talked a bit in our cohort about the isolation of workers now from their neighborhoods, from where they're working, what the unions represent for them, like being an active part of the union versus being represented by the union. What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's very challenging, right? And so, you know, there were some like business unions who kind of treated their members like clients, right? But they didn't survive very long in Racine, and they really shifted. So like the hospital workers at St. Luke's, right? It wasn't until the late 1960s that hospital workers at public hospitals could organize into unions. And so when the law changed and they were able to join unions, SEIU came in and organized them, but then they weren't doing the work in Racine that other unions were doing. And so they were, you know, just getting people to sign cards without actually engaging them. And that led to huge conflict. And today, right, we're not in a position where we can just have people signing membership cards, right? Because there is that isolation, there is that sense of, you know, we are a union, or the union is something separate over there that can do something for me or not do something for me. And unions, really, it's the responsibility of union member leadership to engage their members and to engage into organizing the community. So for me, like the perfect example right now are the teacher strikes in the K through 12, and the ways that, you know, it didn't just happen overnight. And that's why I think it's really important to tell these stories about community organizing. Because in Chicago, right, when Ron Emanuel went through and closed all of those schools, you know, parents actually went on a hunger strike. So you have parents on a hunger strike trying to protect their neighborhood schools. And if the teachers union in Chicago hadn't been responsive to that, and who didn't pick up and work with those parents and fight with them and bring their agendas to the bargaining table, and in this larger platform is called bargaining for the common good, right? That is really what built that momentum over years of developing. Now, same thing's happening in Boston too, and you saw it in Los Angeles and other places where these unions were like, okay, we need to educate our members, we need to talk to the community, and if you don't live in the community where you work, you have two different communities, right? You have your home community and you have the community around your workplace. And all of that matters. So here at Rutgers, right, we had during the early days of the pandemic, 19 of the 20, I think, Rutgers unions got together and formed a coalition. And we said, we're not going to let management come to this group, to that group, to that group. We're going to come together as united front. And we didn't just say, okay, it's just workers at Rutgers, but it's the whole communities around our campuses. So we had coalitions with worker centers, with student groups, right? There was an effort to convert a school into a parking garage near the medical school in New Brunswick. And it was going to displace tons of Latinx students. And, the medical students came out in support of the community and said, okay, we stand with you. And our coalition got together and joined their protests. And those are the kind of things that matter. Like during 2020, with everything that was happening, and unions were putting out these statements saying we support Black Lives Matter, and you saw companies doing it and all that. So if you're just putting out statements, that doesn't do anything. But there are some unions like Unite Here who not only put out a very powerful statement, they showed up and they invited the community to show up with them. So Unite Here members who are hospitality workers and hotels and gaming institutions and everything, they were unemployed, like 98% unemployment in their union. And they were in dire straits. They didn't just close ranks and try to fight just for their members. They said, we need to save the country. And so they actually went out in a door-to-door campaign in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in the Southwest. And they actually turned key states, right? They really influenced the political, the 2020 presidential election. Like without them, we may have lost Georgia. And so it's important to understand how much power we have. But if we don't use it effectively, if we don't communicate, if we don't create those connections, then we're wasting it. But we do have a lot of power. And I think that the unions that are doing the best right now are the ones who are responsive to their members' needs, who are engaging them and making them see, right? So a union is a collection of workers. And we are the unions. Like I am a union member and I'm active in my union because I know that that's the only way that we're going to win. But if I was at a union that didn't listen to me or didn't address my demands or questions, then why would I be engaged? Why would I pay my dues? They're not doing anything for me. I'm not doing anything with them. So it's really a separate issue. And it's a matter of building that sense of connection. And it takes a lot of work today, right? Because, we're all in different places and, we've been meeting on Zoom for over a year, and it's just really hard to build that. But it's the responsibility of union leaders to make sure that everyone feels included and that we're addressing the issues of the day. And that's why you have to be adaptive. And I think that's what helped in Racine. They really adapted. They dealt with the tension. They didn't shy away from the hard problems and the questions. And when union members were, actively against integrating neighborhoods and schools, they held education campaigns within their unions. They sent members to School for Workers and to labor education centers and to lectures to understand that, racial divisions wasn't something that was going to build economic security, and was actually being used to keep them in desperate situations.
Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to tease out a little bit more about the involvement of Racine, Wisconsin union members with the larger community, building cross-sector solidarity. So you mentioned the janitors supporting the steel industry strikes, to the social workers building with the welfare activists, What lessons can we learn from this cross-sector solidarity of building with the larger community? Does this remind you of any organizing struggles today?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of look to the Fight for 15 movement. You know, back in 2012, everybody was like, this is ridiculous. Y'all aren't going to do anything. And here, right, across the country, we have states and local areas voting, you know, people are voting in $15 minimum wages and higher, right? And it's not yet a living wage. But I think that that activism, it's like it starts in McDonald's and it spreads, you know, and that kind of opportunity to build something and not think about, right, okay, how can we get dues money? But really, how can we improve our communities? How can we improve the economic situation of our areas? And I think those are the types of questions that we have to ask. And then we see, and I think that there is a lot of solidarity that's happening, you know, international worker solidarity that's happening right now that I find really encouraging. You know, I was in Wisconsin during the 2011, 2012 protests. And it was amazing to me, you know, at that point, I was the treasurer of my union, and, you know, it really felt like when you're in it, like it's just you and, you know, you're trying to like build something, but then you get all of these words of encouragement from across the world. You know, we're getting all of these proclamations from other unions, and the ways that, and this is what I think is a legacy of that activism in Wisconsin, especially Southeast Wisconsin, that extends into the 21st century. So the attack in Wisconsin was against public workers. Union density in the private sector had been declining for a long time. But for me, what was not just the international stuff, but the local stuff that showed me that people were really, they understood what solidarity looked like, was the fact that private sector workers were showing up. So it's really cool to see like the farmers and the Teamsters, you know, really standing there and saying, you know, I'm a private sector employee and I support public workers. And that kind of ability to work across unions, right, with different groups is the kind of worker movement that we need today. And we need to center the voices of the people who are most marginalized. And so in the 1980s, when immigrant workers were under attack, and you know, I'm saying immigrant workers, and there's really, you know, a lot of Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and there's this idea, right, that every brown person was a, you know, undocumented worker. And that wasn't the case at all. It was a very small group of undocumented workers in Racine at the time. But the labor community stepped in, and to read the op-eds in the newspapers, and to see, you know, the white guy union president standing there saying, you know, this is ridiculous. This is a ploy by management to create discord within our union. There is not a problem of undocumented workers in the city. Nobody is stealing our jobs. In fact, the jobs that they have, nobody wants. You know, nobody wants these jobs. And to see union members taking that stance and really situating my immigrant workers at the center of their working class politics in the mid 1980s in Racine, even as more and more plants are closing, to me is the example that we need today. Right, to center the voices of the most vulnerable, and then we all win.
Absolutely, I hear that. And, you know, in a lot of the work today, and I think we'll close with this question, but in today's gig worker economy and continued deindustrialization, in worker isolation across the states, what do you think is the future of unionizing struggles and coalition building in today's context?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, right? I'm very hopeful. I think we're at a moment now. I feel the energy. You know, there are lots of things that are worrisome or beyond worrisome. Worrisome isn't the right word, but I feel this energy. More and more people are asking, oh, so explain unions. What is it, right? And we may need something different, right? And what we really need is for people to come together. We need white workers to join forces with workers of color to build a multiracial, right, international workers movement. We need people to understand that collective action is the way to go, is the way to beat back this global capitalism that's really destroying us. Right now, we have work that doesn't fit our legal apparatus for employment law in the United States. And so that means that unions have lost a lot of their ability to advocate for workers. And the rise of worker centers over the last 20, 30 years, to me, is giving me a lot of hope. The lot of organization that's happening outside of unions, but still connected to unions, like during the pandemic when the delivery drivers in New York City, right? And then they have the unions come in to support them showing up, right? That's the kind of stuff that we need to continue to happen. That's the kind of stuff that gives me hope. And I think that as more and more people realize that collective action and coming together and stop letting people divide us, right? These artificial divides are really what's getting in the way of people power. There's so much corporate money going into these political debates. And, we need to push. We need to get our senators to pass the PRO Act and to do all of these other things to protect workers' rights. And, we need to cancel student loan debt so that people have some financial security and ability to maneuver. We need expanded healthcare. And we need to save democracy. And I think that's really important. And I think that working people can save democracy. And that we've always have, right? Throughout the history of the United States, it's been working people's mobilizations that have expanded democracy from every step of the way, from before the founding of the nation until yesterday. So we need more of that. And I'm hopeful despite everything right now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Naomi. That is an extremely hopeful note to end on, from seeing the history in Racine, Wisconsin, to your vision of where we can go now with our unionizing struggles. That's the point. We learn from these histories so that we can bring it into our organizing today. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's any other last words you want to give to our audience.
No, I'll just say go out, organize at work, organize at home, organize in your community, bring people together. Prince has a song, it's called Get on the Boat. And it's like, come on, we have room. Just come, join us, join our fight. Let's make the world a better place. It's been such an honor to talk with you, Tahia, and to get the questions from the People's Forum. Really appreciate it, the invitation.
Yes, thank you so much, Naomi. And have a great evening, everybody. This video is going to be available on our YouTube channel. We will have another session in September with Carrie Freshore. More details for the RSVP will be on our website. And with that, we will end. Thank you so much.